Where to begin with Scorn? Well, first off, let me say full spoilers ahead. If you haven't played the game yet, stop now and go play it. It's on Game Pass and it's roughly 5-ish hours long and definitely something you'll want to personally experience before coming here. Or you just don't care and have no idea what Scorn is and you just want to see what it's about? Well, if that's the case, then screw it, let's just get into it. As a fan of Giger's work and just techno-organic / biomechanical art in general, Scorn was practically made for me. Throw in subtle cosmic and bodily horror and you can just take my money right now. When I finally got my hands on the game and played through it, I was left with a strange feeling. An almost melancholic feeling mixed with the want for more. It was almost as if this game was building, and when things started to get even more interesting than it already had been, it just ended. Now, that's not to say it's a bad thing, it's just that I wanted more. And with Scorn's, shall we say, tedious development cycle and overall lukewarm, albeit positive reception, something tells me it'll be a very long time before we have anything else in this universe. Which is an absolute travesty because the world of Scorn is incredibly unique and extremely interesting with an atmosphere that's unmatched. So today, I want to talk a little bit about the development cycle, the game itself, and just the overall story hidden in the background. As always, if you want to jump to any specific topic, there will be timestamps in the description. Scorn was developed by Ebb Software, a Serbian game studio founded in 2013. The game itself is heavily inspired by the art of H.R. Giger of Alien fame and oh god. The game itself is heavily inspired by the art of H.R. Giger of Alien fame and
Zdzisław Beksiński,
both of which heavily popularized biomechanical art. Biomechanical art, for those who don't know, is a surreal art style that combines elements of machines with organics. It's a style of art where technology and biology are one and the same, a perfect synthesis between the two. It's typically represented in warped reflections of anatomy where bone and joints are replaced with pistons and gears infused with muscles and tendons. This Gigerian and
Beksińskian,
biomechanical style of art really set the stage for the world Scorn would inhabit. Scorn was announced in November of 2014 with a trailer showing pre-alpha footage. That following December, Ebb Software would launch a Kickstarter campaign which ended unsuccessfully. Its failure was mostly chalked up to its lack of notoriety. Despite this setback, the game would remain in development with a planned 2-part release. In early 2015, Scorn received private funding from a publicly unknown investor and full production started in February of that year. In 2016, a trailer for Scorn, not just pre-alpha footage, would be released and Scorn finally received the exposure it desperately needed. This trailer concluded with the announcement of Scorn Part 1 being released in 2017. As 2017 came, no news of its impending release was announced, no date, no nothing. Later in that year, Ebb Software launched a second Kickstarter to fund Part 1 of the game along with a new gameplay trailer. The Kickstarter was a success and reached its goal and then some. However, the game was delayed until 2018. In 2018, the company known as Kowloon Knights, a global fund dedicated to funding indie game developers, fully funds Scorn's development, resulting in many changes such as a bigger team being hired, Scorn Part 1 and 2 being scrapped in favor of one whole game, and the release date being, once again, pushed back to an unknown year. In 2020, Xbox showcased a brand new Scorn trailer and announced its temporary Xbox console exclusivity. However, the game would still be coming to PC. Also in the same year, they released a new gameplay trailer and confirmed a release date of 2021. Well, 2021 came and all throughout the year, we heard nothing until December of 2021 when they announced the game would, once again for the umpteenth time, be pushed back, this time to 2022. Then finally, on October 14th, 2022, Scorn would be released. Scorn reviewed at an overall average of 7 out of 10, with most critiquing its short runtime and overall janky combat. With the development out of the way, let's just talk about the game itself. We'll just go over the story the game presents at face value. I'll save my analysis for the next part. Scorn opens with our protagonist crawling through the wastes, attempting to reach some factory of sorts. As they make their way through the factory, they pass the corpses of hundreds, if not thousands, of dead things. The protagonist then frees a dude crammed in a shell of sorts, then uses him to open another door leading deeper into the factory. They eventually destroy a chamber that floods the room they're in with a strange white liquid that traps them. Following that, we change perspective to a new protagonist falling out of this wall of flesh attached to an umbilical cord. This new protagonist makes their way through a field of corpses and flesh until they too reach this factory. They enter the factory and find strange-looking pods containing more humanoids. However, they appear to be slightly different than our protagonist, more smooth and less sinewy. The protagonist is then met by this strange creature that appears to be the mutated remains of the prior protagonist. This parasite then forcibly attaches itself onto this new protagonist. Together, the protagonist and the mutant parasite go deeper into the factory, where they run into swaths of organic material and gore growing on the walls. They encounter these unsettling creatures and fight them off as they delve deeper into hell. They then run into what is seemingly the source of all this unchecked organic growth and find this towering behemoth that simply watches them as they activate a lift it's attached to. Ripping the monster from its sprawling tendrils and raising it up far into the sky, they leave it suspended and enter a tram that takes them to this beautiful decaying castle. The parasite attached to the protagonist has been growing and fusing with them throughout their journey. However, now its growth has reached a point where the protagonist can hardly function. Making their way past oddly sexual statues, flayed open corpses, brain matter spun out like spiderwebs, little people in jars, and cyborgs, the protagonist reaches a breaking point with their companion. Using the technology found in this place, the protagonist removes this ungodly creature from themselves and, gravely wounded, approaches a machine. Its spidery arms grabs onto the protagonist and saws them apart, removing half of their brain and attaching it to this hive mind. They awake inside two strangely pregnant bodies that might be robots. One carries the original corpse of the protagonist, occasionally prodding them with a knife, while the other one opens doors for them. They carry themselves to a strangely mystifying and psychedelic portal where, before they can enter, the parasite returns and tears them apart, forcing them to fully assimilate together into this horrible, fleshy abomination. The end. Okay, so what the f was that? Well, first, before I get into anything, let me preface this by saying that this story is extremely up to interpretation. And that's the developer's intention. A lot of stuff is extremely open-ended and doesn't make sense in some regards and does in others. So there isn't ever going to be a concrete answer as to why such and such is this way or such and such is that way. Only the developers know for certain. The best anyone could ever do is give our interpretation of what we assume the story to be. To do that, we'll be doing a deep dive into the Artbook, which actually sheds some light on concepts and set pieces found in the game, as well as cut content. But also, some things in the Artbook are also vague, so again, it's not concrete, but it will help us formulate an interpretation of this weirdly squishy world. I'm also not going to go too in-depth, rather piece multiple things together from the Artbook to paint one cohesive picture, while occasionally interjecting my own theories into the mix. So, with that out of the way, let's start with the inhabitants. Our first and second protagonist, as well as the main species in this world, are called humanoids. These pseudo-sex organless creatures are birthed from the Genesis Wall, which we see happen when we begin playing as protagonist number 2. Quoting directly from the Artbook, humanoids are neither born from a creature or assembled in a lab, but birthed from ruptures on the side of an unnatural embankment, the Genesis Wall. There is nothing more to it than a wall built not with brick and mortar, but flesh and organs. So this big fleshy wall is actually a living organism that just pumps out these humanoids. The reason why there are so many corpses everywhere when we first emerge is because from all over the wall, humanoids can be birthed. Low, high, it doesn't matter. The lucky ones are lower, while the higher ones are born and immediately fall to their deaths. However, backing up a bit, I describe these humanoids as a pseudo-sex organless creature because they are indeed birthed either feminine or masculine, yet lack any reproductive sex organs. Yet, paradoxically, they know about sex on the account of the statues we've seen. However, I'd argue that they most likely still have a sex drive, yet can't act on it because they're missing their hoo-has and doo-dahs. They're fascinated by the act because they can't act on it. This explains the prevalence of these depictions all throughout the game. So the humanoids want to get freaky deaky, but they can't put the deaky in the freaky, if you catch my drift. Welcome to Shane Please Shut Up, the channel where we expertly avert demonetization. So because of this weird sex thing and their potentially extremely short lifespans, their whole culture becomes based on that dichotomy, the death drive and the sex drive. Not only that, but they see flesh and bone as disposable, while what's contained inside them isn't. This is probably because A, they're born from this big amorphous flesh thing, and B, they see their people die so often that they begin to realize the flesh isn't important, but what gives them life is. The humanoids worship the consciousness in its physical form, which, in their eyes, is identical no matter the sex of the body it inhabits. In their eyes, the self, the mind's eye, is far greater than the fragile vessel into which it's born. So this whole society is formed around the idea that there is nothing sacred about the body, and with no clear separation between biology and technology, it only becomes logical for them to repurpose everything. Essentially, their whole society is organized around recycling flesh, the same way we think about recycling plastic. Over time, the humanoids create this grand civilization known as polis, where they attempt to reach this enlightened form of consciousness. Since they view the body as pointless and recycle flesh so often, they begin to grow disposable creatures. These are called mold men. They are humanoids bred as bodies to be utilized. So mold men, as their name suggests, are forcibly made into a mold, which then acts as a variety of things. Building materials, energy source, flesh farming, what have you. However, mold men were not the only creatures created by the humanoids. They also created the homunculi, born out of the experimentation to seek a different kind of living substance for consumption. They are made of a hallucinogenic matter that people use to reach a higher state of consciousness. They are basically living batteries. Homunculi mature within synthetic jars, swelling in size until every available atom of space is filled. Regardless of their size, they possess great intellect and are even greater engineers that are capable of assembling cyborgs from scratch or fabricating mechanized walking gear to help them mitigate their own physical limitations. Also, in regards to the homunculi, and cut from the final product, was the homunculi civil war. The homunculi yearned for power beyond their station and dreamed of taking over Polis. But ambition breeds greed and conflict, and their army was split into two opposing factions who waged war against one another as a quest for dominance. One faction toiled away repurposing dead bodies to make armored cyborgs, while the other focused its energies into building mechanized robotic exosuits, and inevitably, they clashed, with uncountable losses suffered on both sides. We were supposed to see this cancelled location known as the Labyrinth, where it was basically the battleground of these homunculi. So as humanoids are building up their society and creating these slave-like creatures, they, obviously, rebel, resulting in much of the damage we see in the game. In the end, I don't think there ever was a clear winner, more like mutually assured destruction. Moving deeper into the abyss lies the crater creatures. Beings with shared DNA built from the exact same material forced into instant evolutionary jumps that result in horrific, semi-functional mashups of recognizable and indescribable animalistic elements. It all begins with the Crater Queen, the big monster that watches us. It is, quote, a humpback witch hunched over a cauldron of her own innards, all stemming from discarded parts of living tissue from Scorn's birthing wall. She's the mother of other creatures, wallowing in a darkened lair at the bottom of the crater location. Her job is to hemorrhage an endless surge of descendants. And that's really all we have on the crater creatures. The book just goes into its design philosophy and not too much on their origin. However, I have a theory. This little tidbit was mentioned when discussing the Genesis Wall. The dimensions and shapes within match up to the insides of no known species from the animal kingdom. And are those cordyceps features peeking out from beneath certain folds of tissue? The usage of the word cordyceps piqued my interest. Cordyceps is a parasitic fungus that attacks a host, with its mycelium invading and eventually replacing the host's tissue. If you ever heard of the zombie mushroom bugs, it's that, and it's also what The Last of Us is about. So my theory is that this war between humanoids and homunculi was so dire it essentially killed everything, poisoning the land and causing it to crumble. This, in turn, damaged the Genesis Wall to a point where it became vulnerable, enough for some form of parasitic fungus or entity to partially corrupt it. This resulted in a humanoid being birthed, warped, and altered by this parasite. This corrupted humanoid then fell down one of the vents near the wall and continued to mutate further. They then, with unchecked organic growth, became the Crater Queen, or a dark reflection of the Genesis Wall, spewing out its own horrible abominations. Now here's where things get kind of wishy-washy. The art book never goes into what the was on the ceiling or what the portal was. They touch on how the humanoids are obsessed with consciousness and reaching a higher level of being, but never explained why. The closest thing we have to an answer is found in the description of the shells. Apparently, the humanoids created these things called shells, the pregnant things the protagonists transfer their consciousness into. Shells are artificially created, shells that any humanoid can transfer their mind into. According to the art book, the transferal procedure results in the humanoid's consciousness manifesting into a new physical entity, a nameless creature that looks like a brain and a spinal column that grows frilly wings and tentacles. This entity is free to crawl inside empty hollow shells like a hermit crab seeking a new home, with each shell promising different capabilities. Once a shell has been chosen, the consciousness's next evolutionary steps can begin, which might be going through that psychedelic portal. But also, when our protagonists transferred their consciousness into the shell, they didn't turn into a little brain monster. They just appeared there. This may have also been cut content, but if it was, I'd assume they'd mentioned it as such like they had with all the other cut content. Regardless, this is where the art book starts to contradict itself. This brain thing described sounds and looks a lot like the parasite. However, the parasite might be a mutated form of that higher being. So a true brain thing would crawl into a shell, while this parasite brain thing would crawl into a humanoid. The quote-unquote pure one would become this elevated being, while the parasite becomes this abomination. But what's even stranger is the art book describes those red pods we saw as humanoid incubators with, quote, flying drones busily tend to parasite rooms, misting the atmosphere. So I thought this initial factory was the Moldman factory, yet the book says it's the parasite room. However, we see one of these beings being born, and they don't look like Genesis Wall humanoids or the parasite or Moldmen. So is it a pre-molded Moldman? Or were the humanoids attempting to create something else? Or was this, again, more cut content? And if they are parasites, was the white liquid that mutated the first protagonist being used to create these new beings, and our dude was just hit with too much at once and that caused him to become a monster? So many questions, so little answers, and it's so fun to speculate. The world Scorn creates is beautifully and grotesquely fascinating, and I want to know more. Despite the fact that I beat the game weeks ago, it's still on my mind. I want to go deeper. I want more answers. But the thing is, I don't think we ever will, because that's the point. It's supposed to be vague. It's supposed to be contradictory. It's supposed to be weird. That's the whole point of biomechanical art in general. It's surreal, organic and synthetic in perfect synthesis. And playing Scorn was, in itself, a surreal experience. It was literally like playing through a Giger or
Beksiński
painting, and those paintings aren't supposed to have answers. So while Scorn is f***ing weird,